and at worst is another manifestation of this government's historical desire to control as much aspects of people's lives as it possibly can.
In a country with an over 40% unemployment rate and over 74% youth unemployment rate, GDP growth, maybe if we're lucky at 1% for 2023, if we're lucky, everything else going in our favor, the government is considering regulations around people's lifestyle choices. And specifically, in this instance, we are talking about the Tobacco Products and Electronic Delivery Systems Control Bill. Joining me to discuss the civil liberty implications, but also the implications for South Africans' economic freedoms and also just their freedoms as rational agents and consumers, is Martin van Staden, the head of policy at the Free Market Foundation. Martin, thanks very much for being with us for this very important discussion, especially given how wide the powers are that this bill would give, particularly the Minister of Health. For example, would give the minister the absolute and unconstrained discretion to prohibit smoking anywhere and everywhere if they, quote, consider it appropriate to reduce or prevent the public's exposure to smoking. I mean, what a way to start off on. Your thoughts on the bill and maybe where you think it's coming from, given, as I mentioned, some of maybe the other, crises afflicting South Africa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, firstly, Chris, I always feel it necessary in these interviews to mention that I am a teetotaler. I do not smoke. I detest smoking, really. So I'm not shilling here for my own interests, but very much concerned about the holistic thing that is the consumer choice of ordinary South Africans. And this bill is another version or expression of the government's very paternalistic attitude toward the freedom of people to make extremely elementary and basic choices for themselves. Where is it coming from? Well, the fact that we have these huge crises that you mentioned, amongst many others. Load shedding, my power just went off a few minutes ago. We have a cholera outbreak with water infrastructure not keeping up. Clearly, the government is overwhelmed by the absolute mess that it has created with decades of backward, silly, misguided public policy. And now, as we go into an election year, it is looking for what you might call the low-hanging fruit of showing South Africans that it is doing something to protect their interests. Now, the tobacco bill is not the only example. We have the NHI, which the government probably has acknowledged it cannot afford. It does not have the expertise to implement, but it's doing it regardless because it knows it's a quick media win. It's something that they can say, oh, good, look at us doing this. And I think the tobacco bill, which has been around for decades, really, and it keeps being wheeled out kind of at these convenient moments, is part of that. For the government to say, wow, geez, smoking is such a terrible thing to our public health. And look at us taking these proactive measures in cooperation with the World Health Organization, all these things. Look at how good we are. So unfortunately, this is a political manifestation of what people might call virtue signaling. It doesn't really solve any problems. It's not going to dent unemployment. I would be very surprised if it changes anything to healthcare outcomes. The bill really is just a virtue signaling at best, and at worst is another manifestation of this government's historical desire to control as much aspects of people's lives as it possibly can. Very much out of line with what the Constitution says, which is that ordinary South Africans will have the autonomy, the room to govern themselves and their own affairs without being subject to the coercive imposition of government preferences.
Martin, in one of your recent articles on Business Day, you discussed this bill and some of these implications. We will link to that article in the description below. Just this sort of idea of unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences. You highlight, of course, during COVID and the lockdowns, when government, again, for these ostensible health reasons, decided to ban tobacco sales, where the result of that now, the consequence is that 70% of all cigarettes consumed are from the illegal market. So that possible consequence where you ostensibly want people to live healthier, but then you manifest this through your regulations and your laws, but also some of the economic implications, especially for maybe lower to middle income citizens in the specific instance of domestic workers. So let's assume the person employing the domestic worker is a smoker, but they're not allowed to if the domestic worker then doesn't particularly want that or goes to the Department of Health, or if the domestic worker themselves wants to smoke and they can't come to that agreement as adults between themselves and the employer, but rather this has to be decided from the outside, as it were, from the paternalistic state.
Yeah, no, let me mention some of these provisions, and then one can almost see the unintended consequences that will flow from them. You may not smoke in any car or a private enclosed space, a house, a lapa or whatever, when a non-smoker is present. So even if it's your own house, if there is someone there who is not a smoker, it doesn't matter whether they've said, no, it's fine if you smoke. There is non-smoker. Like, I'm okay if other people smoke in their own property, but if I'm there, I'm a non-smoker. You're not allowed to smoke in your own house if I'm there. That's one interesting provision. The other is, as you now mentioned, there's a provision that says you may not smoke in a private dwelling if it is used for any commercial childcare activity, child stay, for schooling, tutoring, domestic employment, or otherwise as a workplace. So if you employ a domestic helper, and even when they're not there, the fact is you do employ them there, you may never smoke in your house again. Or if you run your own business from your house and you never interface with the public, you're not allowed to smoke in your house. And the thing you mentioned earlier on at the top, the minister's discretion to prohibit smoking elsewhere. So let's say I am a smoker and I live alone. Non-smokers never come into my house. I never use the house for any business activity. The minister, if they deem it appropriate to prohibit smoking there to prevent the public exposure to smoking, the minister can just do that. The minister can effectively ban smoking along the length and breadth of South Africa based on what they consider to be appropriate. Some of the other provisions, this one shouldn't surprise anyone. The Department of Health knows it cannot enforce this law, so of course it is going to be the responsibility of business owners and employers and homeowners to enforce this law. And if you don't, all sorts of bad things can happen to your business license, and you may even be fined, and you may even be imprisoned for several months in terms of this law. You may not, the other thing is, this is not only tobacco smoking, but vaping. You may no longer, if you sell vapes, advertise that. You may not, nobody may create or sell toys or candy in the form of a vape device or a cigarette. I used to, when I was younger, eat these little candies that looked like cigarettes. That would now be totally illegal, because of course this is why we have so many smokers in South Africa. As children, they ate this candy, and now it's like a done deal. That's kind of where it comes from. The minister may also now prescribe standard packaging for tobacco. We knew this was coming years ago, but now also for vaping. We were used to having vaping devices in many shapes and sizes. That can probably come to an end. And probably one of the most nefarious versions of this bill is that it effectively prohibits lobbying by tobacco companies and by vaping companies, because it says that that could be an indirect financial support for this product, and you're not allowed to do that. It amounts to sponsorship. So it's also anti-democratic in a certain way. So yes, as you mentioned, unintended consequences. We're going to see a lot more unemployed domestic helpers. We're going to see people no longer registering their offices at home as their workplaces. We're going to see huge non-compliance. And yes, as we saw during COVID, when government kind of cut its nose off to spite its face by denying itself billions of rands in revenue from tobacco companies, the government is going to do that again, because people are not going to stop smoking. Prohibition does not work. They will buy untaxed, more dangerous cigarettes in the black market, and they will continue smoking, as during COVID, when I think in one of the court cases where this was challenged, the court acknowledged that more people are smoking now, and that they're smoking more dangerous cigarettes in the midst of this ban. So yes, this bill is 20 pages of begging for unintended and unforeseen consequences. And we all know this will happen whenever government tries to regulate our lifestyle choices in such a minute, granular way.
Thank you very much for watching. Let us know in the comments below your views on the proposed tobacco bill and what you think some of the implications could be. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, we invite you to do so. And a reminder, please, before you leave, to like this video. That always helps boost the reach and the views that we get on our videos. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.